One of the areas that perplexes a lot of beginning developers is working with dates and times. And that's partly because there are a lot of different ways to do it, and there are a lot of restrictions that depend on what kind of operating system you have, what kind of database you're using, and things like that just make it into a quagmire that's hard to wade through. So I'm going to give you some of the basics, some of the essential concepts behind it, and then you'll have to take a look at your system and see what works for you and do some research on ways to work around it. But this will at least give you the fundamentals. The first thing that we need to talk about is going to be epoch time, or the Unix timestamp. These are the same thing, and it's the time since the computer epoch began. And so basically that's the time that Unix is going to use for its timestamp. And essentially it's the number of seconds that have elapsed since January 1st of 1970 at midnight. That is the beginning of the computer epoch, according to the Unix timestamp. Since Unix is a file system, it must have seemed like common sense to the people developing it that a file could not be created before January 1st, 1970. The problem comes in when we start using these dates for things besides just files that have been created on a computer and start using them to keep track of birthdays and other calculations. Then we might have dates that go into the past. Now, if we have a 32-bit system, we're able to use dates from December 1902 to January 2037. 1970 plus 67 years to get to January 2037, or 67 years in the past to get to December 1902. And we do that by having a negative number, right? So we can count time forwards and backwards in negative numbers. But that also limits us, right? We still can't talk about some birthdays. We can't talk about dates that happened in history. We can't talk about future Social Security payments and things like that that might happen past 2037. So that's still a pretty limited range. So ultimately, what I think is going to happen is most systems are going to end up going to a 64-bit system of counting, because that will last for billions of years, and that'll take care of all of our needs. But we haven't done that yet. So on your system, you may be limited to 1902 to 2037, and if you're on a Windows machine or maybe some of the older Linux distributions, even dates prior to 1970 might give you a problem. I think I ran into that with the IIS database. Had problems with dates before 1970, and that's because Windows does. If you run into one of those problems, what are you going to do? Well, there's many choices, and it depends on your needs. You could store the date as a string, you could store the year separately from the date, or you could read up on one of the many hacks that are out there on ways to get around it, and the php.net website is full of a lot of those. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I don't want to focus on how you're going to work around the limitations of the computer you're working with, because you may get a shiny new computer tomorrow that handles all of it fine. Instead, I want to talk about the fundamental principles that we're going to be working with to create a Unix timestamp. And there's three ways that I want to look at to do that. The first is just time. Time with no arguments, just have the parentheses, and that will return the current time. And remember, that's the number of seconds since 1970. Okay, so that's the Unix timestamp. Now, the second is that we can make time, MK time, and we just need to provide it the number of hours, minutes, seconds, and then month, day, and year, and it will come back to us with a Unix timestamp, the number of seconds since 1970. Now notice the order there. It gets a little confusing for some people. It has the time first, hour, minute, second, and then it has month, day, year, which is sort of the American way instead of day, month, year like they do in other countries. So they're not in sort of ascending order or anything like that. It's a little bit of a jumble, but that's the order it's going to be: an hour, minute, second, month, day, year. And the last is string to time, strtotime. And then we provide any string to that function, and it will return a Unix timestamp to us, doing the best it can to generate that timestamp based on whatever's in that string. And we'll take a look at that. It's a pretty neat little function. So I'm going to open back up array functions, and I'm just going to do a save as on that file. And I'm going to call this date time underscore Unix, just to remember, because we're going to take a look at some other date time features later. And I'm going to take out all of this, and I'm going to call it dates and times Unix. Now, the first way that we're going to make Unix time, we said, was just with the simple time command. So we'll do that with just echo time. We'll save that, and let's open that up in a browser and see what we get back. So we'll just open up a new window, and we'll go back to our sandbox and date time unix.php. And there we go. That's how many seconds have elapsed, right? And if we reload it, we can see all the seconds as they continue to count. Now, we'll learn how to format that into something that looks nicer a little later. What we're interested right now is just getting that Unix timestamp. because once we have a Unix timestamp, right, we can start to compare different timestamps. We can see when something happened 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago by comparing the current timestamp with the timestamp that we've stored, let's say, in a database or in a file or something like that. The second way we saw that we could make a timestamp is with maketime. And you'll remember that I told you that we have to provide a number of arguments here. We can do those as variables or just simply integers. So the first of those is going to be the hour, let's say 2, and the minute, 30, and the seconds will make 45. And then we need to put in the month and the date and the year. I'll put in 2009. Okay, semicolon there. And let's just, for good measure, let's put in BR tag at the end of this, just so it'll be on a new line. And let's reload it. There we go. So now you see the difference between the current time and the number of seconds there and this date in the future for 2:30 and 45 seconds on October 1st of 2009. And we can actually subtract the two and find out how many seconds there are in between and then convert that to a number of days and so on. Now, one note is that if you give something invalid to make time, it'll return false. So if you try to tell it, the date was February 30th, that's an invalid date and it would return false. Now, there's also another way that we can check whether dates are true that's worth mentioning, and that is with check date. And if we say, for example, echo check date 12/31/2000, and then we'll ask it to return true if that's a true date, or false if it's not. And we can do the same thing again. Let's go ahead and put our BRs in here just to make it nice and clean. But this time, let's ask it for February 31st and see whether that's a date. So if we come back and we reload those pages, you'll see that the first one is a date and the second one is not a date. So check date is also a helpful way to check whether a date is there or not. And last of all, I want us to take a look at that really cool function, the string to time. So let's say Unix timestamp equals string to time. And then we can put in a string that designates whatever time we'd like. Now, this is the cool part. For example, let's try now. And then I'm going to need to echo back that Unix timestamp since I set that as a value. And I'll append a BR after it. Let's load that up, see what we get. So there we are. Notice the times are the same at the top and the bottom. The time now, there's no difference whatsoever. And I could also put in something like 15 September 2004, and then come back. And there's the date stamp for that. I could also do September 15, 2004. And you'll see I get the same date stamp. So it's able to interpret these different ones. Let's try plus 1 day. That's tomorrow. Or we can say something like last Monday. So there's a lot of these different things that we can do that we can pass in as a string, and it's able to interpret what we mean. Now, it doesn't always 100% successful. You'll have to play around and try it out a little bit, but it does a pretty good job of parsing it out and figuring out what you mean and turning that into a Unix timestamp. So keep that in your back pocket because that's a really useful tool. Now that we know how to make Unix timestamps, in the next movie, we'll talk about how to make those into something that's human readable, how to go from a timestamp back to something that we can display that looks nice as output on our screen.